On the day my new roommate hauled his boxes up 3 flights, he wore a baseball cap, a grin, and a certainty about himself. Straight, simple, settled. I told myself to keep it friendly and safe. I'd lived long enough to know better than to crush on unavailable men. But then the whispers started, glances lingering, jokes lasting too long, the quiet comfort of shared coffee at 6 a.m., and the story I believed about him began quietly, steadily, tenderly to change. If this love story speaks to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps more hearts find hope today. I didn't know it then, but the morning Ben moved in would become one of those dividing lines in my life, before and after. It was late September, the kind of fall day that tastes like a crisp apple. I was keeping the door open with my foot and a folded bath towel, trying to decide if the living room rug should be closer to the window, when he came up the last steps, red-cheeked and smiling, balancing a box labeled Kitchen-ish. "You Alex?" he asked, not quite out of breath, which I noted with a reluctant appreciation. He had the look of someone who could lift a couch and not complain about it for the next decade. "That's me," I said. "Welcome to our palace." The word palace did a lot of heavy lifting for a space with hairline cracks and mismatched cabinets, but it had high ceilings, and in the afternoon the sun spilled over the couch like a warm quilt. I wanted it to feel like a refuge. We did the polite dance, where to put the boxes, where the outlets lurked, which drawer had been mysteriously installed upside down. We talked lease terms and trash days, and I pretended not to notice that his forearms were dusted with sawdust like he'd just fixed a fence and then shrugged off thanks with a grin. He was, as my grandmother would have said, a strapping young man, the kind women in the church foyer fussed over, the kind neighbors asked to change their porch light bulbs. He was the kind of man I'd trained myself not to turn into a story. He told me he'd broken up with a long-term girlfriend in June. "It was cleaner than I expected," he said. "No villain, just time." He said time like a thing you can set on a shelf and dust around. He had a baseball cap peeking from the top of a box and a framed print of a national park, and he called the couch couch with a straightforward affection, like it was a person he trusted. I found comfort in the plainness of him. I told myself it was safe. The first weeks were easy. We figured out each other's rhythms like a duet. He preferred the TV sparkling with sports on Sunday afternoons. I liked the quiet of a crossword humming along with a pot of soup. Our mornings overlapped. Coffee at dawn, the kitchen bathed in light so gentle it felt like kindness. He took his mug with a splash of half and half. I drank mine black and strong, the way my father did when he left early for some place that demanded his steadiness. There are things you can tell about people by what they notice. Ben noticed the way the hallway light buzzed and replaced the bulb without being asked. He noticed when our neighbor, Mrs. Green, dropped her mail, and he bent down to gather it and make a gentle joke about coupons. He noticed I'd left a manuscript page on the table with a sentence circled 3 times and said, "I think it sounds true," which is exactly what you want to hear when you're wrestling words. I noticed the careful way he put things away, the non-stick pan hung just so, the dish towels folded into thirds like a small offering. I noticed he wore cologne that smelled like cedar and rain. I noticed he kept a sweatshirt on the back of the chair at the table, the kind of gray that finally gives up and calls itself soft, and I tried not to notice that when he laughed, he tilted his head back and the vulnerability of his throat did something tender to me. We fell into rituals. Thursday night tacos with too much lime, a pile of chopped cilantro, and the one stubborn onion that made both of us cry. Saturday morning grocery trips where we divided and conquered and met in the middle near the good bread, comparing peaches like jewelers. He would toss granola into our cart, I would reach for yogurt, and without talking about it, we'd become a team in these small, ordinary ways that build a life. He played music while he cooked, old country and new folk, a playlist that sounded like a road trip with windows down. He told me stories about his dad teaching him to drive stick shift on a road with too many curves, about his mom's cinnamon rolls that could make a person cry if they'd had a hard day. He was from a place with church bells that knew his name and bonfires that smelled like home. I liked hearing him talk about those things. I liked knowing the map that led to the person I could see. And I told him about me. I told him about the first time I said, "I'm gay" out loud, and the way the air felt afterward, like the pressure had changed and a storm had passed. I told him about my first apartment with too many plants and too little light, and my second apartment with neighbors who were loud in a way that made you feel less alone. I told him about my mom's tendency to send me links to articles about heart health, like a prayer disguised as a hyperlink. He listened the way you hope people will, with curiosity and care, and when he asked questions, he did it with a soft hand. He would call himself straight in the offhand ways straight men do. I've never been to a pride parade, but I'd go as support. Or, I don't know anything about fashion except that those shoes look expensive, with a grin that made me poke him with a spoon. He dated, in the loose, flaky manner of someone who knows the script. But the dates didn't stick, and he came home and told me about them with a shoulder shrug and a lightness I recognized as a shield. I dated, too, a few long dinners that turned into polite goodnights. There was a kind barista who liked poetry and a trainer who liked efficiency in meal prep. I didn't tell them about Ben because you don't tell people about the person you have disciplined yourself not to imagine that way. I have learned to manage my own heart like a careful gardener. Prune, water, don't let it overreach. If you're paying attention, you often feel the shift before you can say it. It started like a loose thread catching on a cabinet handle, small, repetitive, almost nothing. One night we watched a movie, an old favorite, the kind that has worn a groove in both of us, and when a character made a mistake, I said, I would forgive him. Ben turned to me, not in judgment of the character, but to study me, the corner of his mouth doing something I hadn't seen before. Later, at the sink, he lingered while I washed and he dried, and his shoulder brushed mine twice, and the second time, neither of us moved away. He began to show up in my day in the spaces I used to reserve for myself. He'd text me a photo of a sunset he swore was more dramatic than it looked. He started asking questions that felt like he was pulling a chair up to the table of my inner life, how I handle holidays when I want to be with family and also need space, what my first crush taught me about patience, whether I believe everyone has a song they're meant to sing, or many. These are not the questions you ask if you're just passing time. And then there was the night my friend Jules invited both of us to her backyard to celebrate her new job. It was early October and cold enough for sweaters. The trees were doing that brave, beautiful dying they do. There were strings of lights and a fire pit, and someone made a cheese board that looked like architecture. A few of my friends from the queer community were there, and they welcomed Ben with the kind of kindness that comes from deciding ahead of time to be generous. A guy named Mateo made a joke that landed sideways and then corrected it deftly, an apology folded into laughter. Ben was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "Thank you," and his voice had a weight I hadn't heard. On the walk home, he defined the feeling. It felt good to be in a space where everybody was paying attention to what they said so everyone could relax. He put his hands in his pockets like he was reminding himself they were there. I liked it, he added, almost a surprise to himself. I told myself not to make it mean anything. I am an expert at not making things mean anything. Still, the next morning he asked if we had a rainbow magnet for the fridge because the grocery store had them near the register. We don't need to put everything we believe on the fridge, I said, teasing. He said, maybe we do, and pinned it next to a recipe for banana bread. One Wednesday, the heater decided to audition for retirement. The building hummed, our vents sighed, and not much happened. The landlord said, we'll get a guy. The guy never came, as they sometimes don't, and by evening the apartment was the kind of cold that makes you serious. I made stew, and Ben found extra blankets, and we ended up on the same couch under the same throw, watching our breath fog the window. He shifted closer, and close felt like warmth. And then he tucked the edge of the blanket around my shoulder without looking at me, which sometimes is more intimate than eye contact. I could feel my heart in my mouth. Not because we were touching. Roommates have huddled under blankets since blankets were invented, but because of the way the room had changed color. I am old enough to know you don't borrow feelings. I am also old enough to know that sometimes the truest thing is to admit that the room is not the same. A week later, we stood on the roof, watching the city comb itself smooth under evening light. He turned to me and asked, "Did you ever have a plan for the exact person you'd end up with?" I said I used to, and told him about lists I made at 20 and threw away at 25 when I realized people are storms and gardens, not checkboxes. He nodded like he was tucking that away, then said, "I don't know where I fit anymore," and then regretted it like he'd said too much. We let the wind carry the pieces away. Sometimes time does work you can't. We both watched a plane cut the sky, a silver bead sliding along a string. The holidays came, with all their gentle chaos. My mother sent a tin of fudge wrapped in ribbon, and Ben's mom mailed a box that smelled faintly of cinnamon with knit hats inside. We opened them at the table with the care those moments deserve. A few days before Thanksgiving, my cousin, Aaron, the kind who tries too hard and drinks faster than he should, dropped by. He's not unkind, but he lives with a sharp edge that sometimes scrapes. He made a joke about how our apartment looked very curated, which was code for something more. I felt my spine lengthen. Ben put his spoon down, not loudly but with purpose, and said, "It looks like a home where people are paying attention." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room recalibrated and Aaron softened, and we moved on. Ben and I stayed up late that night, washing dishes slowly, turning over that moment like a stone in our hands. "I wanted to say the right thing," he said. "You did," I answered. He stood there for a second, then nodded once, like he was agreeing with a coach, and we went to bed. I lay under my quilt and let myself feel grateful for the kind of courage that shows up in kitchens. Winter came bright and sharp. The city tucked itself into scarves and mittens. We invented soups and swapped recipes with neighbors like middle-aged farm wives, and we were not embarrassed about it. On a Saturday that glowed white, Ben asked if I would go with him to an LGBTQ+ book fair downtown. "I want to learn," he said, and he said it the way you say you want to bake bread or build a desk, a skill to reach for with your whole body. We walked aisle after aisle, flipping through titles and covers that felt like confessions and celebrations. He bought a memoir and a children's book about families that don't fit one mold. "For my niece," he said carefully, and then, "For me, a little." On the way home, he asked me what it felt like to be seen. Not broadly, not by strangers, but intimately. I told him it feels like being given a glass of water when you didn't say you were thirsty. He said, "I've always liked girls in the gently stubborn way a person states the way they take their coffee." Then he added, "But sometimes it feels like there's a door I never tried. And after a beat, and I keep walking past it." He waited for me to toss him a life preserver or an answer that would make it tidy. I told him, "The room on the other side isn't scary, and you can stand in the doorway until you feel ready." And then, because I needed to be honest for both of us, "No one needs you to choose a word right now. Words will show up when they're ready." He let out a breath I hadn't realized he was holding, and we walked the last blocks home not needing to fill the space with anything else. We were very careful after that. I was careful not to take his questions and build them into a future he hadn't promised me. He was careful with my heart in ways that made other women I'd dated jealous of the tenderness we showed each other without being a couple. We made a pact at the table one Tuesday afternoon, spoken without drama. If either of us gets confused, we pause. He held up his pinky like a child, and I hooked mine around it because sometimes a simple thing is the strongest chord. The world kept being itself, messy, lovely, everything happening at once. We cheered for a neighbor's new baby, and we took turns feeding their cat when they were at the hospital. We replaced our shower curtain liner after pretending it wasn't time. Ben's sister sent photos of her toddler holding a snowball like a delicacy. I finished a draft that fought me, and he brought home a bottle of affordable champagne, and we clinked glasses on the couch and let bubbles speak for us. In the corner, the rainbow magnet held up our utility bill like a quiet wink. One night, Jules invited us to a small, calm bar with live music. The room was warm with that particular hum that happens when people feel safe. Ben was fidgety and restless like he was trying to fit into a new coat. We listened to a singer with a voice like honey poured over gravel, and between songs, Ben leaned in and said, "May I do something that scares me?" I said yes because I believe in courage. He took my hand under the table and didn't move it. Didn't try to make it mean anything except exactly what it meant. It lasted the length of a song, then another, and I felt the steady drum of his pulse through his palm. He looked at me, unsure and also sure, and I squeezed once as if to say, "I see you," and "We're okay." We didn't talk about it until a day later. In the kitchen, on a Wednesday that smelled like garlic and warm bread. "I've been thinking," he said, turning a wooden spoon in his hand like he was winding courage around it. I always felt certain of who I was because certainty was easy, but lately. He looked at me, and it felt like watching someone step into sunlight they thought was for someone else. I think maybe I'm more than the word I've used, and I don't want to run from that because of fear or because it would be simpler. I have had my heart walked on, and I have walked my own heart into rooms it didn't belong in. I know the difference between being a science experiment and being chosen. I asked him if this was about me or about him. He didn't flinch. "Both," he said. "You're my friend, you're my safe place, and when I see you, things in me get quiet. But even if you weren't here, I think I'd still be standing at that door." We cleaned the kitchen very carefully after that, like people make tidy the rooms where they tell the truth. We went to our rooms and slept restless sleeps that were still kinder than the ones we'd had in our 20s. In the morning, he left a note on the table next to the coffee pot. "Not long, not dramatic. Let's talk tonight." With a question mark and his handwriting, which is handsome and straightforward, like him. We talked on the couch where we had eaten popcorn and watched movies and cried at a wedding video someone put on the internet for strangers. We talked about what to call things and what to agree on. We made a little map of the next few months. Not a contract, but an intention. We would try. We would date while living together, which is an Olympic sport and not for the faint-hearted. We would tell people in our own time. We would bring our kindness like a tool we never put down. Then Ben said, "Before any of that, could I kiss you?" And he said it with a seriousness that deserved an answer that matched. "Yes," I said, "because I've learned to say yes to the good that arrives as carefully as it can." He kissed me like he was learning and remembering at once. There was nothing hurried in it, nothing that needed to prove itself. It was the kind of kiss that makes you understand why people write poems about firsts. Afterward, we didn't do that thing where people laugh to relieve tension. We stayed quiet and leaned our foreheads together and breathed like we'd run to meet each other from very far away. He looked at me like I was a landmark he'd only just realized had been guiding him for months. "Thank you," he said into the air between us. And though I could have made a joke about thanking me, I didn't. I let the gratitude be a third person in the room. Dating your roommate is a recipe for romance, and for tripping over shoes you told each other to put away. We made rules, because rules are loved by another name when they're made with care. No big conversations after 10 p.m. No assuming the other person can read minds. If one of us wanted to invite someone over, we asked in advance, and we were honest about how it felt. We agreed to a once-a-week date night out of the apartment, where the lighting wasn't ours and the tables were wiped down by someone else. We told almost no one at first. We let the secret be ours, not because we were ashamed, but because we were building something that needed time in the shade. Then we told Jules, who squealed and also said her one piece of advice: assume each other's best intentions until proven otherwise. We told Mrs. Green when she noticed the way he stood close by me at the mailbox. "I wondered," she said, kind as a blanket placed over sleeping knees, and then told us her granddaughter came out last year and that the world didn't end. It just rearranged itself to fit more love. We went to the park on Sundays and walked until our cheeks were pink and our fingers numb, and when we warmed up in a coffee shop, he reached for my hand under the small table. a habit that grown on him like a good one. We went to an art museum and stood in front of a painting that was a storm made of blue. He whispered, "I used to think I had to be a particular kind of man. And then, I like this one better." I pressed my shoulder against his and felt the words enter the places in me where doubt sometimes camped. There were awkward moments. The first time we tried to cook together after our first kiss. We bumped hips and apologized like strangers, then laughed because there is no way to kiss someone at a table on Tuesday and then act like gravity is the same on Thursday. There was the day we had to tell our landlord we wanted just one parking spot and why, which we did not have to do. But he asked, and we decided practicing honesty matters even in small bureaucratic rooms. He said okay in a way that meant he had known before we did, and then asked if we'd water his plants when he went to Florida. We told his sister on FaceTime. He said, "I'm seeing someone," and she said, "Finally," and then, "Tell me everything." And he told her everything except the parts that belonged to me. We told my mother on a Sunday afternoon, and she said, after a very small pause that was her recalibration, "Be kind to one another." And then, "Do you need any kitchen towels?" Which is how my family says I love you. She sent towels with blue stripes and a note tucked in the corner that said, "Call me whenever, about anything." We weren't trying to be brave. We were trying to be true. We took it slowly, because slow is not a synonym for lack of passion. Slow is a kind of reverence. We discovered the patterns of each other's days that matter, the way he gets quiet on Thursdays when the week feels long, the way I get restless if I haven't seen open sky for a few days. We learned how to say, "I need a little time," and not interpret it as goodbye. One Saturday night, a woman from Ben's past wrote him after seeing him tagged in a photo with me. She used words like phase and confused, the way people do when they think their certainty about someone else can write the script for a life. He read the message and set his phone down like it was warm from being held too tight. He didn't ask me what to do. He asked me if I wanted to take a drive. We drove west, where the city loosens and fields begin, to a place with a row of paper lanterns I'd told him about once. We walked the path and talked about how people like their ideas of us better than us sometimes, and how that hurts. That night, he wrote her back and said this, "I know what I want. If my label is shifting, it's because I'm learning more about my own heart, not less. I'm happy." He showed me the message because transparency was one of our rules, and I didn't correct his words or suggest edits. I kissed him on the temple and said I'm proud, which he held like a talisman. Later, there would be a conversation with his father. It wasn't dramatic like movies make these things. It was quieter. On a porch that had been sanded down and stained again and again, with a wind chime doing its work in a corner, his father asked careful questions and said careful things. Ben told him the simplest truth. "I love a man. His name is Alex. He's good to me, and I'm good to him." His father looked at him the way fathers look at sons when they're choosing between their idea of the world and the child in front of them. Then he nodded once, like a small boat choosing its direction, and said, "Bring him for dinner next time. Your mom will want to know what kind of pie he likes." We were by then out in the open, not loudly, not with signs. A friend snapped a photo of us at a street fair in May, and we looked like two people who had stumbled into a calm together. Ben began to introduce me as his boyfriend. He did it with careful joy, like he was unwrapping something he'd been given that he wanted to last. He said the word easily after weeks where he had tried a few on and they pinched. I liked hearing it, not because it was new, but because it fit. There was a day, early summer, when the landlord told us the building had been sold and our rent would go up. We learned that love and money tangle in hard ways. We sat at the table with numbers and browsers open to rentals and those stern columns that tell you what you can afford. We didn't panic. We did what we had learned to do. We made a plan. We visited apartments with floors that slanted and views that made your ribs expand, and we argued gently about whether a closet and a walk-in closet are things you can say without laughing. We chose a place with light that felt like a promise and a little balcony that made our friends volunteer to bring plants. We moved, this time together, our books and mugs and history already partly braided. Mrs. Green cried when we loaded the last box. She pressed a paper bag into our hands with foil-wrapped sandwiches, because even the most modern love stories are held together by the kind of kindness that is older than any of us. We gave her a photo of us and our new address. "I'll write," she said, like a woman sending soldiers to a gentle war. She has. Her letters arrive with a slanted script and stories of the trash can lid that refuses to close all the way and the neighbor who sings off-key with conviction. In the new apartment, we carved out corners, a desk near the window for my work, a chair for him near the shelf where the memoirs live, because he likes to pull them down and read a chapter at random. We learned the way the light moves across these rooms at different times, the spot on the balcony where the basil grows best, the time of day when the children downstairs stack chalk in rows and declare it a castle. We learned the steps to each other all over again, not because people change entirely, but because the context of love shifts the choreography. There were hard days, because life keeps being life. A family illness, a work deadline that landed like a third roommate with bad manners. A night where I said something careless, and his face closed like a door because it reminded him of a voice from a long time ago that didn't mean him well. We learned to apologize and to ask for forgiveness in ways that sounded like us. We learned that sometimes love is buying the good ice cream on the way home and not saying anything until the other person has had 2 spoons of it and thawed. We kept doing small, ordinary things. We made Sunday pancakes and argued about whether blueberries belong in the batter or on top. We taught each other the songs from our childhoods, the ones you don't realize are part of your bones until you hear someone else hum along. We walked in the heat of July and the sharpness of December and let the seasons do their work on us. We kept a drawer in the kitchen that was just for cards and stamps, because I consider writing to be a love language, and he had learned to appreciate the way a piece of mail with your name on it can anchor a person in their own life. In late summer, we took a trip up the coast, where the ocean insists on being noticed. We booked a room that offered a view of water and the kind of breakfast that arrives in a basket. We sat on a cliff and watched the water lift and move and drop, and it felt like the reaching and resting of a heart. "I used to think I had to build a life that made sense to everyone," he said. "Now I think the point is to build a life that is kind and honest and fits on my shoulders." I kissed him and said, "It looks good on you." On the last morning, we walked down to the beach where the lighthouse keeps its old faithful vigil. An older couple stood near the railing, passing binoculars between them. She caught us looking and waved us over. "There's a whale," she said, like she was sharing a secret and a gift. We looked through the binoculars and saw that magnificent dark back rise and fall, a curved letter written on the surface of the sea. Ben squeezed my hand in the way he does when he is moved beyond words. And the woman, noticing the gesture, reached for her partner's hand too, the way you do when you see something true and want to anchor yourself to what endures. We went home to our lived-in life, to bills and laundry and the chair that has begun to mold itself to his shape. We took turns taking out the trash with a sort of ceremony, because people who do ordinary things with love elevate them. We continued to be gentle with the labels and fierce with the truth. He told me one night, standing at the sink with his sleeves rolled, "I don't feel straight anymore. That used to scare me. Now it feels like I'm not breaking a rule. I'm finally not pretending to believe in one that was never mine." He looked at me with something almost like relief. "I don't know if I'm this word or that word," he said, and then he smiled, rueful and real. "But I know I am yours." We are not the before and after of a makeover show. We are 2 men in a kitchen, turning the flame down on a pan so the garlic doesn't burn, laughing at a joke one of us will forget tomorrow, saving a seat for each other at a table we built with patience. If there is a lesson in our story, it is this. People change because they are allowed to, because the ground beneath them is safe enough to risk taking a step. Love, real love, is sometimes a quiet hallway with lights that lead you where you were meant to go and a hand you can hold while you walk there. We still watch sports on Sunday because habits matter, and how you make room for each other's habits is a way of saying, "I love you." He still wears that gray sweatshirt on the back of the chair because it is comfort woven into cotton. I still drink my coffee black, and he still adds cream and makes a face when he tries mine, and we still believe that breakfast can save a morning. He will always be the man who notices the buzzing light and changes the bulb. I will always be the man who circles a sentence 3 times and needs someone to say it sounds true. A year after we became the kind of roommates who share a toothbrush holder and a life, Ben's niece visited and asked, in that plain way children have, "Are you both uncles?" We looked at each other and Ben said, "We are both yours," and that seemed to settle it. We walked her to the park and pushed her on the swings and ate ice cream that melted too fast in the sun, and afterward, when she came into the kitchen with sticky hands, he lifted her like he'd been doing it forever, and she laid her head on his shoulder like it was a place built for resting. There was a piece of paper on our fridge, near the rainbow magnet, with a recipe for cinnamon rolls written in his mother's hand, smudged a little with butter. We make them on Sundays sometimes, and the smell draws us into the kitchen even when we were not headed there, and we laugh about the way sweetness finds you. We are not in a rush to define the rest of our days. We are not afraid either. We have a list on our phones of places we want to go and things we want to do that runs from Alaska summer to teach Mrs. Green how to text emojis. We will probably do 60% of it. That will be enough. If you had told me at 30 that I would sit across from my straight roommate and watch him become a man who said, "I am not what I thought I was, and that's good news," I would have said you were writing fiction. But life remains the best storyteller. It writes quiet arcs and patient scenes. It doesn't always care if you understand the plot in the middle. It asks you to keep showing up for the next chapter, to keep a chair for grace at your table, to hold your own heart softly so it will be ready when someone offers their own with the same tenderness. On our first night in the new apartment, after we'd set the bed up and leaned the mirror against the wall and promised each other we would never move again, even though life has a way of laughing at declarations, we lay there in the dark and listened to the building's new language, the pipes, the neighbor's footsteps, the way the street light threw a kind square of glow on the ceiling. "Hey," he whispered, like a child who was learning that whispering mattered. "Thank you for being the reason I wasn't afraid to open the door." I reached for his hand and found it, the way you find the light switch in a room you know. "Thank you for opening it," I said. We lay there and let the simple truth settle between us like a blanket. Outside, the city did what cities do, moved and breathed and planned the next day. In our bed, in our home, in our tender, ordinary life, we did what people who love each other do. We rested together and woke up ready to keep choosing.